brick by brick. I was happy to see that the poll results were showing that the majority of you have little to no experience in Databricks. That is exactly the right level of experience that we're looking for, because if you have a lot of experience, whoever the Databricks guru is probably going to feel that this is way too basic, or if they're just wanting to learn about, okay, how do we get started again on Databricks, then maybe they'll be fine with it. But the rest of you absolute beginners, you're in the right place. First of all, a little bit about me. My name is Andy Letourneau. I'm a senior data consultant with 3Cloud Solutions. You can contact me through my 3Cloud email or on Twitter at Lady Runa. Now, a quick summary about myself. I have a bachelor's in mathematics and physics from Smith College. I have just over 25 years of experience with SQL, both as a developer and a DBA. And I have about 4 years of experience with Azure and cloud technologies, and I am a certified Azure administrator. As you can tell from the two little pictures down here, sewing is my superpower. All right, so today I'm going to introduce you to Databricks. And I'm going to turn off my webcam because it sometimes takes up too much bandwidth. If I can find my webcam. Stop sharing. There we go. Okay, I'll turn that back on later on when we're ready for questions, but I'll leave it off because I found that sometimes the sound gets garbled when I keep it running. Anyway, our agenda today, we're going to find out, well, what is Databricks? Most people might have heard the name, but you don't know what it is. Then I'll give you a little quick tour of the Azure Databricks Workspace. I'll show you how to get Databricks set up so that you can go use it. And then we'll walk through a little bit of the actual uses of it using notebooks, which is going to be your most common place for working with Databricks. And then also some basics of working with data in Databricks. Okay, so what's Azure Databricks? Azure Databricks is an Apache Spark-based analytics platform, which has been optimized for Azure. Databricks has built-in modules for streaming, SQL, machine learning, and graph processing. It's often used for processing and transforming massive quantities of data and also for exploring the data. Databricks features optimized connectors to the Azure Data Lake and blob storage for the fastest possible data access and one-click management directly from within the Azure console. So as you can see from this diagram, everything that's within Azure integrates with Azure Databricks, plus various inputs and outputs work fine. People of all different lines of business can wind up working with Databricks, and all kinds of applications can work with it. So it's kind of a good one-stop shop for just about everything that you might need. Okay, so here's some of the uses for Databricks, just a bunch of quick bullet points. Databricks can prepare data, so it can import, clean, and aggregate data from many sources. It can perform analytics, allowing you to explore large data sets in real time. It can help you find hidden patterns with advanced analytics algorithms, and then you can publish these results in dashboards where people can look at, as reports, just like you've seen in SQL reporting. You can also build data products. You have rapid prototyping. You can implement advanced analytics algorithms, do some machine learning, create recommendation engines, do some pattern recognition and graph applications. The good part about Azure Databricks is, unlike in other online systems, cloud systems that we have, it's a first-party service. Other clouds, it's a third-party service, which means it may not fully integrate with everything, at least not as easily as it does within Azure, where everything is tightly integrated. Your billing for Databricks is right in your Azure subscription billing. So everything's kind of an all-in-one source. You can launch the workspace from the Azure portal. You can access the data lake store and blob storage. You can use Active Directory for authentication so people don't have additional logins that they have to worry about. Again, you can access all Azure database things such as Synapse or Cosmos DB, Azure SQL database. You can use Kafka, and you can even link to Power BI for more data visualization, kind of a one-stop shop. All right, so this is the workspace that you will see when you first set up your Databricks implementation. The nice thing, Microsoft has started to add in links to documentation, administration guides, and then a bunch of little just quick click things. If you know, this is what I want to go get started on. If I want to import data from a file, I just hit that and hit go import. For most other functions though, you're going to go hit the Launch Workspace button, which is going to pop up this window. This window is essentially your main control panel for Azure Databricks. We'll be taking a look at the actual one shortly, but let me just give you a little quick tour here of what we have. They have a bunch of quick start tutorials, which will help you get going right away. After this webinar, I recommend that you go and start up your own Azure Databricks and then go run through the tutorial to learn a little bit more about it. And I just realized that I do not have my cluster running, which we will do shortly. So I'm going to get that coming up. I'm going to actually move him over here so I can get the cluster running. All right. So next step in the workspace, we're going to talk about notebooks. This is your main interaction in Azure Databricks. What a notebook is a place where you're going to write your code. It's going to allow you to include some documentation in there, and you can use it to control operations through these notebooks rather than through a console. So this is going to be your main use. You can create a bunch of them. They can be shared workbooks, or they can be workbooks specific to your user. Okay. Inside these notebooks, you get to use a plethora of languages. I noticed that in the what languages do you know question, just about everybody said, yes, I know SQL. I have been hoping that that would have been a multiple choice, because I know that there are some people who know not only SQL, but they know a whole bunch of other languages. So within Databricks, you can code in Scala, Python, R, and SQL, and you can also switch among them. So if within your favorite language, there's certain things you can't do, you can, within the notebook, switch to another programming language in a later cell, and then switch back to your favorite language. This makes it a lot easier. I've had experience with, I was writing something in Python. I needed to log into a system, but that particular system's password had a character that was a reserved character in Python, and I couldn't get it to compile. So I switched to Scala, did more or less the same command, but in Scala accepts that character as not a reserved character, and it let me do the login, and then I could switch back to Python for the remainder of the work. So that to me is very valuable, because there are many times when you will need to switch among languages. Okay, so this is the Databricks cluster. What the Databricks cluster looks like is it's a set of Azure Linux VMs. However, unlike what you would do on-prem if you were trying to reproduce this, where you'd have to build each of these VMs individually, you'd have to put on all the software manually and all that. This, when you tell Azure Databricks to build the cluster, it will go and set up everything and install all that you need on your cluster VMs as is appropriate for what you're doing. So you'll have the right version of Python in there, the right version of Scala, the latest version of Databricks all installed. Now, both the jobs and the application code run on clusters. There are two different kinds of clusters. There's the all-purpose cluster. This is created and started manually by you, and they are used with notebooks for collaborative data analysis. That's the kind of cluster you're going to be using most of the time in your active use. Now, there are also job clusters. These are initiated natively by Databricks. They are spun up just before the job runs, and then they're spun down as soon as the job is done. And by using the job cluster, you can actually save money, because the cluster will only be running during the time that the job is running, and it will be at the power or size level as required for that specific job. The clusters that you do regular work in, those you'll probably be using a slightly smaller cluster, just to, again, to save money, or maybe you don't need that. But the job ones, you could use a much larger cluster, which will allow it to run very quickly and turn off. And of course, when your cluster's running, you're paying for it. When your cluster's not running, you're not paying for it. So that's an important consideration to have. All right. There are also some of you who said that you worked with Python are probably familiar with various different third-party libraries that Python requires. There are a number of libraries that are already built into Databricks, allowing you to do certain kinds of analysis. without adding in anything. However, you may have some special libraries that either your team has come up with or just ones that aren't native to Databricks, but they are needed for the nature of your work. You're more likely to need these libraries if you are working with machine learning rather than just if you're just doing regular data processing because you're a SQL person, you want to try to use Databricks for ETL, you're probably not going to need any because all the libraries that come pre-installed with Databricks are pretty much the same as what you need, so you won't need to add new ones. Now these jobs, SQL people will be very familiar with this kind of job setup. Pretty much the same idea. You schedule a job and it will run, you can have it run a specific notebook that can do things. As you see on the screen here, you can have it send alerts. You can also select within the type of job, you can tell it, this is the size cluster that I want to use for this specific job. This allows you to have maybe a special cluster set up if you need that, or you can just have maybe it's only a small cluster you need because your job doesn't need that much power. Here's a list of things you can do with Databricks. Loading data. We have a lot of data sources that are supported. They will be adding on more sources, though most of these are the ones that you'll work with most frequently. For example, delimited files, those are your CSV and text files. ORC and Parquet files, which are other formats. Parquet files are nice because they're really highly compressed and they tend to work fairly fast for querying. You have these files can be already in the Databricks file system, or you can go upload them separately, your choice. Most of the time, you're probably going to be working with blob storage or data lake storage. If you've got streaming data or something like that, it's going to land in the storage, and then you can use Databricks to go process it. You can also work with Kafka and Redis, and it supports almost anything that supports JDBC. I say almost anything because I'm sure there are a few things that don't work yet, but they may work later on in the future. Some of the structures that you can use is what they call data frames. In Python, this is also very much like a table if you are a SQL Server person. So you can use, so that's the traditional Spark data structure is the data frame. And Spark SQL is, I call it a slight variation on ANSI SQL. If you speak Oracle SQL or Microsoft SQL Server SQL, you'll be able to do 90% of it very easily within Databricks using the same language. There are a handful of things that have been changed and that's documented very well so you can see, oh, I do it this way instead of that way. And the Delta Lake, which is based off of the Azure Data Lake, the cool thing about it is it allows ACID transactions. So the regular data lake storage, if you go and you want to read from a bunch of CSV files, you can't update the records or change the records. And there's no way of tracking the history of what you've updated or changed. However, in the Delta Lake, it actually records the history, which I find is rather handy. So if you're looking into working with Databricks and taking advantage of the Delta Lake so that you can manage all of these Parquet files or CSV files that have come from other sources. Definitely read about the Delta Lake. There's a bunch of presentations on that, which are really good and very educational. I know the big question is always, yeah, okay, so how much does this cost me? You know, your bosses are always going to ask this. So what I did is I pulled up, you can see the URL down at the bottom, the Microsoft pricing calculator for Databricks. And I just said, okay, give me, you know, kind of an average size one. What would it cost if we kept it running the whole time? Now, I, of course, look at this and go, wow, my MSDN subscription only has $150 a month. How does it survive? Well, it survives because I can turn off my Databricks cluster when I'm not using it. So at night, when I'm not using it, it's turned off. I don't pay for it then. So the price goes down. So that's kind of how you can save if you're saying, wow, you know, if you say $3,000 a month is a lot, don't worry, you can turn it off and you can actually run some Databricks. Mine is being run on an MSDN, and I haven't zeroed my amounts. All right. So now I'm going to get ready to go demo, but before I do that, do we have any questions from anybody? If you've got questions, let me know. Crystal, were there some? Crystal, were there any questions?
Not that I can see, no.
Oh, okay, just wanted to make sure. All righty, well, I'm going to go into the demo, and again, I'm going to turn off the webcam so that Databricks doesn't get all glitchy. All right, so in Azure Services, if you want to create a Databricks, it's fairly simple. You type in Azure Databricks, and you will find it. Gives you a little intro page. It even gives you pictures of what you'll see for screens, and hit create. Select your appropriate subscription. You can choose an existing resource group, or you can create a new one. Whoops. Oh, I didn't want existing. Create new. There we go. Demo. Okay. So I created a demo resource group for this. And then the workspace name. Oh, demo brick. There we go. Okay. Select your region. Usually everybody will select a region that's close to them. So for me, that would be West US because I'm out in Arizona. And then the pricing tier, this is kind of just your big choice for creating it, the standard and premium. There's also a trial version. So the trial version, I would recommend you can go do that as your first one. For 14 days, you'll get to experience what the premium is like. And then it will automatically, well, what it will do is it will ask you, do you want to upgrade to premium? You say no, and it will downgrade to standard. Or you can say, yes, I do want to do the premium. Obviously, the premium is far more expensive than the standard, but the standard for the most part works pretty well. There's a handful of differences in what the premium is. I would definitely hit this where it says view full pricing details, and it will give you the information on the difference in costs and also what some of the benefits that you would get from premium. Most of the time I've seen in dev, people will use standard, and then premium would only be used in production if they feel that they need some of the additional features that are premium only. So once you've got that, so I have that on standard. In networking, you can deploy the Azure Databricks Workspace without a public IP, and you can deploy it in your own virtual network. I don't have a VNet set up in here, so I wouldn't select either of these personally. But if you do have to have this for your job, you will probably want to consider having it with secure cluster connectivity or in your own virtual network so that you can make sure that it's a lot more secure than just the standard version. You have an option to enable infrastructure encryption if you want them. I believe it probably costs more. I'm not registered to enable that, or in that case, my MSDN solution probably doesn't have, it's not set up for having that in the subscription, but a regular subscription, you could set that up if you want. By default, Azure does encrypt the storage account data at rest. Infrastructure encryption will add a second layer of encryption to your storage account data. And they give you a learn more click where you can get more information on that. Tags in Azure, a lot of times you'll see this and you go, why do I have these tags? This is used more for billing. This way, if you have a tag because you want to group particular resources together as a billing set, this stuff is owned by the BI team. So you'd put, maybe tag would be name and the owner would be BI team. And that would be different from the Azure items that perhaps the marketing team has created. And by doing that, it's a lot easier for your administrators to keep track of billing and where everything fits in. Okay, then of course the review and create here, you'll review that and create. You can also download a template for automation. I'm not going to hit create this time. I don't need a second Databricks workspace because I already have my own, which is called Bricky Bricks. So we're going to just jump to this one because it's already created. We don't need to wait 15 minutes for the other one to be created. So once you get your Azure Databricks service created, you'll see it's got, again, the basic launch thing. So we're going to launch the workspace. This is the part what we're actually going to work with. It's signing me into Databricks. There he goes. All right. Basic window, you've got your tutorials, blank notebook. These are all quick links. So if you've recently worked with certain items, they're going to be there on the list. Links to documentation, very helpful. Your home button is going to pop open your workspace information, where, as I said, you can have either all of your users' files, they can be separated into directories, or you can have shared. These shared ones are the ones that you're going to be using for collaboration. Everybody on your team, or at least whoever is working in that particular Databricks workspace, will be able to see them and share them, which is pretty cool. Now, this workspace button, surprisingly, this is why I find the home button funny, because it's almost exactly the same as the workspace button. It just pops up the list. Your recents, of course, this is what did I go to recently? It's just a typical list. Okay, on your data tab, you're going to find, I have a database called Bricks, and I have actually created, within that database, there's a table called wine that has some data in it. And what's nice is that just by simply clicking on the table name, it's going to go and it's going to show me the column names. And as you saw, it took it a moment to pull it up, but this is the actual data that is in the table. So it's kind of a little bit more convenient than SQL, is that it will do essentially, select top 20 from there. How many times in SQL have you done that? You see a new table. Well, what is in this wine table? Select top 20, find out what the information is. Gives you a better idea. But here, all you really have to do, you just go in there and select it. There are multiple databases in there. The default database, I don't have anything in there, but I do in this one. You can filter the tables. You have the option of, if you click on the down arrow, I can then drop that table right here rather than having to write out anything for it. So now let's go to clusters. As I told you, I have a cluster here. I had almost forgotten to start it up. And since it does take a good 5-10 minutes to start, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that it was up and running during the earlier part of the presentation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to create a cluster. So we'll give the cluster a name, make up whatever you want. You guys probably will have some standards for how you want to name the clusters, how you want to name your Databricks. The cluster mode, standard is probably what you're going to use most of the time. Every once in a while, you might want high currency. That is optimized to run SQL, Python, and R workloads concurrently. For general practice, I found that the standard is fine, especially if it's a cluster that's really only being used by me. I don't need anything fancier. High concurrency you'll want to use if it's going to be a lot of people using it at the same time. The final one, called a single node, really should only be used if you're doing development and you're all alone, you're just using it. Because if you've got multiple users on there, that cluster is going to be too weak to be able to bring back data in an appropriate amount of time, and you'll get frustrated because it'll feel slow. It's slow because it's not going to be able to distribute things because, again, there's just a single node on that. So standard is what you'll probably use unless you find that you need more. If you create a pool, and I'm not going to create one for this, but that allows you to keep a certain number of instances on standby. This would be, again, more for production loads where you want to have someone standby so that if it does need to upsize, it can upsize a heck of a lot faster than it normally would. Databricks runtime version, 99% of the time, you should choose the most recent version. The only time you should choose an earlier version for your cluster is if perchance you have some legacy type code that you need to run on an earlier version because it's no longer compatible and you're not yet ready to to upgrade to the new version. So here you can see that down at the bottom there, we have the 5.5 version that has your Spark 2.4. So if you need the earlier version of Spark, you can go with these. The thing is, of course, items with the older versions, this is legacy stuff, and it's stuff you should consider upgrading because the latest and greatest tends to run faster. The ones with the letters ML after them, those are probably should only be used for machine learning. They include a lot of the machine learning stuff. The regular ones don't have the machine learning in there. So if you know you're going to need a cluster for machine learning, you would pick an ML cluster. Otherwise, I would just go and pick the 8.2, which is the most recent one as of today. All right, so they do have some options. Auto scaling, of course, is a good idea because this way it's going to start off with the minimum number of nodes that you have when I fire it up. And then it can scale up to the max number if it's needed for whatever the workload, and that allows it to be dynamic. Definitely a thing to have on. It'll help you save money. The more VMs you got in the mix, the more money it costs. Also, another thing you should do is this terminate after a number of minutes of inactivity. This means it will automatically turn off after it has been running for a certain amount of time and nobody has done anything on it. 120 minutes is the default. That's something that, yeah, you could probably put on, say, your UAT or something like that to have it turn off. For my personal cluster, I think I have it set for 15 or 20 minutes. And that's just because I don't want to forget about it and I don't want to pay more than I have to pay for it if I do forget to turn it off. With this, once I stop doing queries on it, it's going to turn off automatically for me. And that definitely makes life easier. So I would always have that on unless for some reason, say in your production system, you've decided, nope, we need to have this data cluster up 24/7. If you don't, then you're better off having it spin down and then have your users spin it back up. Worker type allows you to select what style of VMs you have. I'm just going to stick with the general purpose for now, but you can see there's some memory optimized and storage and compute optimized and accelerated. Each of these different sizes, they'll of course come with different costs. These numbers here, if you've created a VM in Azure, you will recognize those numbers as different standard sizes for them. Choose, I usually just stick with the default min workers, max workers. Once you've gotten going on here and you've done a load, you may find, well, okay, 8 workers is not enough. You can go increase the numbers. And then your driver type, normally you would make that exactly the same as the worker. I've rarely seen a reason to change it to something else. And there are some advanced options. This is where you could go add if you have a special Spark configuration or additional variables to put in. You can throw in your tags, setting up logging, or if there's an initialization script that you want it to do. Okay, so that's that. And then I just would hit create cluster and that would go create it. Again, these take about 10 minutes to spin up. So I'm not going to start him. I'm just going to abandon him. In your jobs, this is where you can schedule things. I see somebody saying spin up the cluster on a schedule. This is where you would go and create the job. And here you can have it spin up automatically a cluster that you want it to work with. And then if it's running on this new job cluster, once the job is done, that cluster will disappear. If you're choosing an existing one, then you can, then you'll have to make sure that it's running. I think that you can have it scheduled to start. So it gives you retry policies. You can select the notebook that you have in there. Let's do that one, boom. And then you can say how many concurrent runs you want to have for it. And I didn't give it a name, but that's okay. I'm not creating one. But that's how you can create it. Right now, this is manual. I can set up a schedule for it. And then I can also look at when things have run. The models tab here, I don't have any models. I don't have a machine learning cluster. On this one, I haven't created them, but this is where if you did have some machine learning models, this is where they would all live. And you'd be able to look them up, see how up to date they are, or anything like that. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into the workspace and go up to my clusterino, and I'm actually going to just clear the results. I like to clear the results in the workbook because that essentially just resets it for what you need to do. You'll see in here, I've already done demo part 1, which was our workspace tour. I also did demo part 2, which is creating a cluster. So now we're on to this, which is using notebooks. If in a workspace, if you wanted to create a notebook, it's as simple as clicking on that little down arrow and then selecting create and then notebook, and it will create a new blank notebook for you, which you can then go and add things to. You could also hit clone, which will duplicate a notebook. I found that using clone is handy, especially if you're doing training, so you can keep a copy of what the original notebook looked like and then create your own version of it and experiment with that, make changes as you choose. You can import a notebook. Do I have any on? Yeah, I probably have some. I just don't remember where they are. You can, if you have exported the notebook into a DBC archive, it'll be a .dbc file. You could then take those DBC files and import them in. So if you need to move it from one Databricks service instance to another Databricks service instance, that's how you would do it, is you would export it from here and then go import it elsewhere. Okay, and you can have a link address if you want the URL for the notebook. So that's that. Now, in here, you'll notice that unlike in SQL Server where we just have comments, here they have what's called Markdown. This particular notebook, its default language is Python. I can click on that and I can say, oh, I want a language that's not Python as my default language, and then everything that shows up down below is going to be in that. I'm not going to change it right now because that will probably cause some problems, but we'll leave it as is. The file, you've got all these options of, you can move it to trash, you can upload data and export it. In the edit mode, if I want to copy cells, delete them, the cell is, you can see this one rectangle, it says CMD1. That's a cell. This next set here is another cell. So that says, do you want to copy some? Do you want to do find and replace? They even have, and I love this, they have format SQL code. So if you type in SQL and it's a little sloppy looking, you can hit that and it will straighten out your SQL code into what is considered, standard formatting, although some people like them in different ways. You can also, if you change the view, the standard view is what we've got there, where if I run a cell, the results show up below it. They also have a side-by-side. Of course, since I've cleared the results, the only code versus non-code that you're going to see is the markdown. So with a markdown, there is some documentation on it, so you can see, well, how do I do these? The little pound signs here, you can see those are going to be headings. The other stuff is pretty much just regular paragraphs. And there's a bit more to it, which we'll get into a little further down. But there you can see exactly how those work. I'm going to put it right back into standard again, just because it looks a little better. You could hit this, run all, which will run all of the processes in there. You saw me already use the clear results to clear it out. This little picture over here is neat. This is your keyboard shortcut. So depending on whether you're in edit mode in the cell, which means you're in there and you're actively typing in stuff, there's certain keyboard shortcuts that you can use. And then if you're in command mode, which is when it's already ready, and right now it's in command mode, each of these. So you could use these to go run different things. So that's very handy to have that there because you're going to forget how it works. You can schedule it. So I can create a job right from here that will then go and run this notebook. This particular notebook doesn't have any reason to be run regularly, but if it did, that's where I could schedule it. Comments, I put this in just as an example, so I threw in this thing, and that was actually just to remind me, don't run it because it's not going to work. But you can see I can add comments, I can edit the comments, make additional comments, and these comment things will show up only around where you have code. They don't really have, I noticed the comments, you can't put a comment in where there's just the markdown, but you can put it in where there's code. Experiment would be if you're using machine learning, and then revision history allows you to go back to an earlier version of the notebook. So if you're, right now this is my current version, if for some reason I wanted to go back to one of the versions earlier in April where I knew I had done something, I could go back and get that. It also does link in with Git. So now that we've done that, you remember from my notes that I could ignore that. I can also go and add in, if I hit that plus sign, which I did twice, you can add in more of these and delete them if you don't want them. You can show and hide the code, the results, add more cells. If I want to export this data somewhere, I can, or if I just want to copy the text that's in there, I can do that. So that's an example of this percent run includes environment setup. Environment setup was another notebook that's in a subdirectory, which doesn't exist right now, which is why we can't run it. And that would allow you to have one notebook run another notebook. All right, now you can execute, as I said, we can execute code in multiple languages. The way that you do that is you specify which language you want to use, and then it will run in that specific language. So the default language, the built-in language that I have for this one is Python. But if I want to switch to SQL or Scala or R or file system commands or Markdown, I just prefix it with that. Then if we want to say switch to Scala, I can hit the run cell. And I'm also going to run the SQL one right after. So you can see here in Scala, it's a print line. And in SQL, it's your basic select, as we all know and love. So switching among languages is as easy as that. And you can see that even all in just a single notebook, if I ran all of these, it's just going to flip between those languages. And it will allow you to carry those variables along. You can also render some HTML. So this is just an example of, here's the HTML that I've typed in, and then I had it render. If you create you can create documentation cells using the Markdown. So this file will be made available to you guys. I forgot to send it to Crystal earlier, but I'll make sure that she's got it available on the link so that you can have it. But this shows you some of the basic Markdown, how you can have the different headings, how you can create tables, include images, and really do a whole lot of fun stuff. Finally, let's go start working with some data. That's kind of the more exciting thing that I know you all are looking forward to. So within Databricks itself, it actually comes with a handful of directories that contain files already. These Databricks data sets, it comes with it, which means I don't have to do anything to get this data. I could just go look at it. So here's the list. You can see they have some COVID data. They have, I don't know what the adult thing is, but they've got airlines, they got Amazon, medical, weather, wiki, just a whole random assortment. I, of course, saw the wine quality one and said, okay, I'm going to work with that. So I check out, here's a way to say, okay, just give me the first N rows of the CSV file for wine quality here, and I just want to see what's in it. So FS is shorthand for the module dbutils.fs. And if you type in the help command, it will give you plenty of information on what it is and how it works, and provide some examples of different commands that are available for the file system. Now, the next thing that you'll want to do, of course, is, well, now that I've got this particular file, I'm going to start, this is working in Python, and I'm going to say, okay, display to me what are the files that are in this directory. So this gives me the information. Apparently there's some red and white wine data in this particular directory. Now let's go jump back to SQL, because this is stuff I know people know. We can use Spark SQL. Spark SQL, you put the commands actually, as you can see, just in double quotes within parentheses. So all this did is it created the database if it doesn't exist. So there's a database that I created called Bricks, and now I've switched to Bricks, the database. So my next command, you guys are all familiar with SQL, so you can easily figure out that this is, if the table exists, drop it, and then I want you to go create the table. And in this case, the type is CSV, and you can see that I did have to specify the delimiter in this case. So now it has created the table and has populated the table. So the next thing you'd want to do, of course, well, we got to query the table, right? And this is your basic SQL, right? Select star from wine. So again, this is something you're going right back to stuff that you already know. Describe is a new special SQL command that we don't use much in regular SQL, but in here, describe wine is essentially the same kind of command as giving an SP help on the table. Is you want to know, hey, what are the data types for each of these columns? And I think absolutely all of these columns are doubles, except for quality. Okay, another thing you can do in here is we're going to just group things together here. Let me just run that. There we go. So what I want here is I can graph it. Okay, I have the quality and I want the residual sugar. Now in their database, residual sugar, you need to have the little tick mark, which is a key right above your tab key, and you use that instead of the square brackets for column names that have 2 words. So this allows you to do that, do a graph. You can hit the plot options. There's a bunch of different types of charts. You've probably seen these if you've used Excel. You've seen a bunch of these different styles, so we can switch it to a line chart. I'm just going to do that. You can also, if I had more columns in this query here, you could, of course, select different ones, move them around, take them out. If I don't want the quality grouping, I can just have that, or I can put it back in. So that allows you to do whatever you want. When I hit confirm, that's just asking me, do you want to rerun this query? It's a fast query, so I'm fine with that. I need to re-get the data. So I can take this plot here, and I could switch back to a graph if I want. I'll switch to the plot. Also, you have the option of downloading it, and I just clicked on the down arrow, and I have exported that CSV file to my hard drive. Another thing you can do is you can add if you want to have parameters. So if you're running a notebook as a job, I'm going to add a parameter. In this case, I'm doing the quality 6. If you remember here, I have the qualities is 3 through 8. So 6 is kind of just, a generic value. So let's say we run this where we're saying everything with a quality is greater than 6. So now that's all I'm going to bring back. There's the rows with the quality greater than 6. Again, just doing very simple examples for that to show you. Now I can change this if I do 7, and then I run this guy again. Now it's going to have all the qualities are greater than 7. So you can see how very easily you can have that as a parameter where you can put in a value, to make your notebooks more dynamic. Okay, obviously I want to remove that widget. I don't need it right now because that's all that I needed it for was the quality. And that looks like just about it for my demo. I have here, this is in your PowerPoint that you've downloaded, links to resources, including the Databricks documentation from Databricks proper, the Azure Databricks documentation, which is Microsoft Azure's version of the Databricks documentation. There are some differences, of course, between the two, because the regular Databricks documentation also covers using the non-Azure Databricks. So if you're using Databricks, but you're in Google Cloud or AWS, you'd want to go to docs.databricks to learn stuff. but Microsoft does have its own Azure specific documentation. Microsoft Learn has several courses that are related to Databricks. I recommend that you go take a look at those, and you may find a bunch of other stuff that is really fascinating there as well that you'll want to learn from. Apache Spark documentation is going to give you a better understanding of what drives Databricks, that is the engine that's underneath the hood, the part that we're not actually touching, but it'll give you a better idea of how it works and what all it can do. And that's about all I've got for today. You know, the questions thing does not show big enough. I see like half of a word.
If you hit the square where the arrow's coming out, it will expand the view for you.
Oh, okay. Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, that's better. Now I can read it. Okay. So somebody said they missed the difference between regular Databricks and Azure Databricks. So Databricks itself is its own company, and Microsoft has fully integrated Databricks within Azure as a first-party product. So it owns it and it's part of regular Azure. However, you can use Databricks outside of the context of Azure. So if you go to databricks.com and you create a Databricks cluster there and you don't associate it with Azure, you can still run it. But if you want all the integration with Microsoft Azure, then you will definitely want to use the Azure Databricks version of Databricks. And somebody said, will the recording be available online? Yes, it will. Okay, how does Databricks compare to other ETL tools like Data Factory mapping data flows? And is it more expensive? In some cases, yes, it will be more expensive. I would stick with what I found is you can use Azure Data Factory for most of your ETL. Now, there is some ETL where you are going to use Databricks. Cool thing is, and within Azure Data Factory, you will see that you can run a Databricks notebook within Azure Data Factory. So if I want to, I can just have it all within Azure Data Factory. Databricks is its own entity. You can do all of your ETL in Databricks. Your preference will mostly be based upon the skill set of the people who are doing it. Azure Data Factory is a lot easier to use. There's a lot more graphical stuff. Databricks, as you saw, when you have a blank notebook, you have to type in all of the stuff to get it to do things. Whereas if you want to do a copy in Azure Data Factory, you just drag and drop the little copy command and say, here's my source and destination. In Databricks, if I wanted to do that for coding in the source and destination, I would have to type in all the words to get it to do that. So that's kind of what makes the difference between them. Okay, somebody asked, could Databricks be used to load data from a source like GP, which I think it's Great Plains, and transform the data and load it into another SQL database? It can load into SQL databases. It does take a little bit of effort to, you'd need to hook both of the databases into Databricks, and then you could run queries doing that. My demonstration was using a SQL database that is actually within, so this Brickybricks is actually living within the Databricks environment rather than being a separate one, but it can integrate with Synapse. And I just saw, yeah, when would I use Databricks versus Synapse? Good question. It depends. Synapse is more for your data warehouse. So within Synapse, it has Azure Data Factory. Well, if it's got Azure Data Factory, you can actually hook in Databricks. So in that case, Databricks would probably be used for the types of transformations where you find, I can't do it in Azure Data Factory, but I know a guy who can do the stuff, in Python. Then you would use it. You will also use it probably for machine learning. Okay, somebody's asking, oops, boy, they're scrolling now, lots of questions. No, somebody asked, is it true that Data Factory is only for structured data and Databricks for unstructured. Not quite. I can query structured data. In fact, this wine table here, now that it's in a table, that is very much like a regular SQL database table. It's structured data. You can query unstructured data in both. So the majority of people, though, I think would use Databricks for the more unstructured, the big data stuff, but you can use Data Factory for that as well. Yes, I will get a copy of the notebook and I will send that to Crystal and she will send it to you guys. Somebody asked if they have a full Python code, can you run it in Databricks environment without problems? You should be able to. It partially depends upon the version of Python. You do have to make sure that you pull in all of the correct libraries that you require for that code. Once you have the correct libraries, you'll be able to set up a fairly large VM in your cluster. If you're saying it uses a lot of RAM, more than 32 gigs, just check your cluster sizes and find one that can take all the RAM and that has a lot of worker nodes in it, and then you should be able to do it. The industry standard, okay, somebody asked, what is the industry standard in terms of use of language for Databricks? Technically speaking, Databricks native language is Scala. So most of the time, it prefers Scala. You can default to Scala. If you're having problems with something, you're going to have to learn Scala. However, it works very well with Python and R, and as you saw, SQL. So much of it's going to be whatever your code strength is, that's the language I'd recommend you do it in, although you should try to learn at least a little bit of Scala for the occasional instances where you find that your language cannot do what you want it to do. Databricks should be able to do it in there. I don't know. Somebody asked, do you know if Databricks is competing with products like Snowflake? Possibly. I've never really researched to find out what the competition would be. And now I'm going to scroll up and see if I can find other ones. Need a none option for the language poll. Whoops. And hooray for Glenn, whose daughter's a Smithy. Yay. All right. SQL data load. Yes, there are some SQL data loads that would be supported. I guess what this person, somebody asked, are SQL data loads not supported? As far as I know, you can load from SQL in Databricks, so they are supported. You just need to look into it. Somebody was asking about pricing. You need to consider, do you need to consider VMs separately? Is that included? Yeah, the VMs, the whole cost for Databricks includes the use of the VMs. So if you choose more and larger VMs, the price changes. It does some networking. So that pricing item that I showed was actually an example of what the whole system would cost. But it does separate the cost because the all-purpose compute workload for Databricks system is one part of the cost, and then the VMs that you add into it for your workers is going to be another portion of the cost. And I believe that's either billed separately or shown separately. I think ML clusters do cost more than non-ML clusters. Somebody had asked about that. Again, you would have to go look that up on the pricing page, which you can see over there, and then you can see how much they are. And then this looks like, I think this was the last question. Is there a way to automatically spin up the cluster on a schedule? I believe there is. I would have to check into that. We got 2 minutes left here. Let me go to my cluster here. And well, there's a restart. There may be a way of doing that, possibly in a job. You might be able to schedule it to spin up. But if you're going to be, again, if you're going to be running jobs overnight, instead of manually spinning up the cluster, just tell it to create its own cluster when the job runs, and then it will spin things up and spin it down. You really only want to have these clusters up and running when you've got people working with them. But I don't see anything that says scheduling on there for this particular guy. And somebody asked, can you take a variable from the SQL cell and use the variable value using Python or Scala and vice versa? Yes, you can. There are some tricks to passing those variables from one language to another. Of course, it's more complex than merely using it straight. I would probably, if you have a variable you're going to assign a value to, would be to create one of those widgets where it's up there, because all languages can reference the widgets. And Crystal, I think I hit all of their questions. I'm just scanning quickly. Can you give a reel? Is Databricks the best way to use Spark? Yes, mainly because it's easier. It's a lot easier to use Spark in Databricks because it handles all of the management for you. You've got this UI that will allow you to do it. So I would definitely use Databricks rather than raw Spark, which is a lot more complex. There's a lot more moving parts that you have to go with. And Crystal, we're right at the top of the hour. So if you see that there are questions that I didn't get, please send them to me and I will try to answer them in the blog.
All right, sounds good. And as for everybody else, like Andy mentioned earlier, this will be recorded. You guys will receive the recording tomorrow around noon Eastern Standard Time in your email box. As for our previous webinars, you can always find those on YouTube under free webinars. If you guys have any questions or anything that we didn't hit on that you guys would like us to talk about in the blog, please feel free to email myself or Andy. We will be happy to get you taken care of. I thank you guys so much for joining us today. Andy, thank you so much for hosting. And as usual, I hope you guys have a good rest of your Tuesday.
All right. Bye.
Bye.